Hello, and welcome to the fourth in our lecture series, which I've titled Hadza Language Documentation 2019 to 2026. As with previous lectures, this one will be made available online at Zenodo via the DOI on screen. The purpose of today's talk is to fully contextualize the Hadza language documentation work with which I've been involved, first by providing a detailed timeline, and next by examining the archival deposit which has resulted from the documentary work. We'll start with the timeline. And here, blank for now, we have a start at 2019, the year during which the first formal documentation project in which I was involved with Hadza began. However, initial engagement with the Hadza community began rather earlier than that. My first visit to meet with members of the Hadza language community happened back in 2016. And from that point on, I'd spent some time meeting with Hadza people, understanding their feelings about their language, and talking together about how a language documentation project may or may not be appropriate for their situation. The image on screen is from a meeting which Richard Griscom and I organized with members of several language communities of the Tanzanian Rift, during which we talked about current language dynamics and how people felt about recent changes. Some of this initial discussion here at this meeting is captured in a report which we put together, which will be listed in the references at the end of the lecture. Richard and I received two separate documentation grants from the Endangered Languages Documentation Program, ELDP, which ran from late 2019 until late 2021. Most aspects of these separate projects overlapped, and because of this, we structured them to work as more or less a single project. As such, Richard and I arrived in Tanzania in late 2019 and began the project, the first few months of which I'll focus on in the coming slides. A talk given around this time provides a good sense of what we felt the project had to contribute to the body of existing Hadza research, as well as how we wished to orient ourselves in relation to it. At this stage, a lot of our work was simply getting a sense of the communities, including how to get to, from, and between them. One of our contacts put together a hand-drawn map of some of the communities for us, which is in the image on the left. The image on the right is of me taking a GPS reading on the way to a primarily Datoga-speaking community called Endagulda. One of the things that characterized this initial period was months of unexpected rain. A strongly positive Indian Ocean dipole in late 2019 meant that East Africa was experiencing unusual rainfall and flooding. The QR code on screen gives some more detail on the meteorology that defined the setup phase of the documentation project. The leftmost photo is of me stuck in the mud while traveling between Arusha and Simiyu regions. The middle photo was taken while Richard and I waded out a downpour under a baobab tree in Simiyu, and the rightmost photo is one taken of me in a very wet Sungu village. Despite the inclement weather, we managed to visit a large number of Hadza communities, and together with the Hadza people themselves, we assembled a team of Hadza speakers who would conduct most of the research, and held a 5-day training workshop in Haidom town in mid-January. This is an image of the group taken at that event. For a detailed look at what we did, as well as reflections on how we would do it better next time, we put together a report whose full reference will be in the references at the end of this lecture. One of the conclusions of this report was really that 5 days was not enough to properly train the local researchers. And this reality was reflected in the weeks that followed as Richard and I traveled around the Hadza-speaking area between the 5 research stations which we had established to provide continued support, as well as to set up each of the stations with electricity, which they would use to charge the audiovisual recording devices, as well as the computers they would use to organize the data and transcribe and translate the recordings they'd make. The image on the left is one I took of Richard on our way to Mangola via the long way across the Mbulu highlands. The image on the right is of me back in Sungu helping in the installation of a solar panel and a solar panel system at the research station there. For some particularly good discussion of this part of the documentation project, my colleague Richard gave a talk towards the end of 2020, full reference to which I'll give at the end of the lecture. From around April 2020 until August 2021, the project entered a phase during which the local researchers worked with increasing autonomy, recording the bulk of the documentary materials of this funded project. The image on screen is of local researcher Jacobo Lubumba recording a story, where the teller is sitting inside of a traditional Hadza house. Over this time, several presentations given by Richard and I reflected on what we had learned from the language documentation project thus far, such as this one, in which we talked about who speaks Hadza versus who gets to be counted as being Hadza. These two, which were in a way complementary to each other, and examined the unique advantages of community-led documentation. And this one, in which I spoke about the legacies, intended or otherwise, of Hadza research. In terms of active reflection on the documentation project itself, I gave a talk in late 2022 which focused on the challenges we faced. And this talk, a couple of months after, in which I focused on providing a rather fuller retrospective, given that the first funded project had, by then, been over for more than a year. The following months focused primarily on tasks associated with archiving existing audiovisual materials, their continued transcription and translation, as well as thinking about ways in which to keep the language documentation running. Here, in the image on screen, are a group of those who had been involved in the research up to that point, mostly in the capacity of local researchers. Here, we were meeting in Haidom Town to design a follow-on research project. This follow-on project was funded by the Firebird Foundation for Anthropological Research and ran from late 2023 until 2025. The year and a half that followed saw a documentation focused primarily on the area to the northwest of Lake Eyasi, an area which unfortunately was not well integrated into the previous efforts. The image to the left was taken during a training session in which Hadza local researcher Bunga Paulo, here in the right of the photo, traveled to Sungu to provide training in audiovisual language documentation to new local researchers Mayunga Muguli to the left and Paulina Nyerere at the center. The image to the right is a still from a recording in which Paulina speaks with Holomagembe. I gave a report on this part of the documentation just a few months ago, whose full reference will once again be provided at the end of this lecture. In addition to all of the scholarly outputs listed above, which primarily focus on the act of documentation itself from sort of a procedural and reflexive perspective, several works focusing on the Hadza language were also published. Of these, Griscom and Harvey 2020 holds a rather special status. This is because this publication is the archival deposit itself. That is, it is the repository in which all of the audiovisual materials from the funded projects go, and in turn, it is the repository of language and cultural material upon which the empirical publications depend. As such, it is this research output on which I'd like to focus as a case study in the coming section. Titled appropriately, the Hadza Language and Cultural Material Archive. First, the Hadza collection itself is housed within the Endangered Languages Archive, ELAR for short, along with deposits large and small from over 400 other languages, each of which can be seen as a single point on this map. Importantly, ELAR is a digital archive. That is, it doesn't host physical documents and artifacts as a more traditional archive like the one in the image to the left. Instead, all of ELAR's holdings are electronic, so the contents are made up of sound, video, image, and various text files, such as in the image to the right. All in all, the Hadza collection currently contains sound and media files from approximately 306 hours of recording. And because quantity is a dimension of the comprehensiveness of a language documentation, a quality that documentarians aspire to, a natural question to ask is, well, is this language documentation large? The answer is actually not that easy to find. It turns out that there often isn't an easy way to access how many hours of recordings are contained in an archival deposit. And so we can only rely on the handful of recent detailed deposit outlines made by other documentary linguists. And when we take these reports into account, it does turn out that yes, the Hadza documentation is relatively large. In fact, the only similar sized deposits I currently know of are represented by the Ihanzu and Gorwa deposits, documentary projects with which I'm also involved. Now, the follow-on question naturally is this documentation big enough? This sort of question is even less straightforward to answer. We need to recognize that quantity is only one dimension of what makes a language documentation comprehensive. And depending on the goals of the documentation, this may be sufficient or it may be not. The point is that this kind of measure is only one among a range of others, only some of which will be explored in this talk. With that said, let us return to looking at the Hadza deposit on its own, and we'll break down what these 306 hours of recordings actually are. So of these 306 hours of recordings, about 4 hours are of consent, about 70 hours are of elicitation, about 17 hours are of prompted speech, and the rest, about 215 hours, are of natural speech. And broken down into a chart showing minutes of recordings per month, the distribution looks like this. We will return to these graphics and variations of them throughout the remainder of the talk. The first type of recording, here coded in blue, are recordings of consent. This is a series of recordings either of myself or one of the local Hadza researchers going through a verbal template, typically in Swahili, in which we ask participants for their permission to be recorded, make it clear how much they will be paid for their work, as well as generally talk about concepts such as archives and open access. The script is largely adapted from the one provided in Claire Bowen's 2008 book on linguistic fieldwork, and I think is a good, pretty comprehensive model. We decided that all consent would be collected orally rather than in a written form to avoid mistrust around signing unfamiliar-looking contracts, as well as to help include people who may not be able to read or write. Elicitation refers to the highly planned kind of recordings in which speakers are providing tightly controlled language input. There are several different types of elicitation, but the primary ones to feature in the Hadza collection are translation and back translation. Translation refers to elicitation sessions during which I would provide an utterance in a contact language, so usually Swahili, and a speaker would respond with their Hadza equivalent. This can be seen in this short clip in which I ask Gonga Petro for a reduplicated form in Hadza by giving him a Swahili phrase to translate.
Huyu ni Tandalatu.
Similarly, back translation exercises also work between two languages. So typically, these will involve me producing a phrase in Hadza, with the Hadza language consultant then translating that phrase back into our contact language, Swahili. I then use this information to check against my understanding of what I had been targeting in the original phrase. So this example is from a session that I did with Janjaiko Usainia, in which I provided a Hadza phrase. Then he provided a fixed version of that Hadza phrase, and then he provides a Swahili translation at sort of my continued prompting.
Onoko a elata kitabuku. Onokoa elata hatsapeko. Tena? Onokoa elata hatsapeko. Na maana yake kwenye Kiswahili sasa? Ni mimi niliyotengeneza hiyo kitabu.
Moving to prompted speech, it forms the smallest data type collected. This is mainly because of its rather more limited usefulness as a project progresses. That is, as a linguist's understanding of a language grows, the need for speech in sort of a medium restricted context decreases as one begins to work more efficiently with natural speech. With that said, prompted speech is still a useful kind of material and even features in recent rounds of data collection. All of the prompted speech in this collection involves the use of stimulus tools, setting up a situation in which a speaker or speakers would produce speech that in some way will yield a specific sort of data. This can be seen in a set of data I collected just this past summer. This recording, which goes along with the photo on screen, is of some work I conducted based on the Kingdom's Field Guide of African Mammals. So working in small groups, we would review lists of animals which were or are hunted by the Hadza people, and this would be the prompt, and we talk about their names, their behavior, their natural history, as well as if there were any stories or songs associated with them.
Yakamba. Yakamba. Kundi. Kundi ta kutibe ayakamba ye. Cham. Yi takaka ubabima. Tukume.
Kokoe. Finally, the largest and the most heterogeneous type of recorded data in the collection is represented by natural speech. This includes recordings of basically any sort which have not been contrived by the researcher and during which the speaker or speakers are the least constrained in what they say. They may be based around a single question, like something like, let's talk about Hadza food, or perhaps a topic in which somebody volunteers, today I'm going to tell you a story from the past. The two primary subtypes represented within natural speech are conversational texts and ritual texts. A conversational text is, as the name suggests, an event in which at least two speakers are involved. This was the most common sort of recording made by the Hadza local researchers. So here we have Hadza local researcher Mariamu Anyawire, so here she's off camera, sitting with Tumaini Njagela talking about the rainy season.
Taya aso eta tuma ono akwana aka kaka ngaka ana bebe akena mo khiko u ka thone nana khokoma api onko ete ani khena ito ma khena ti khena ito ma akala be na ta ka ta tutsu eta maka fe akwa thone na ka kwa isho kwa okela no kela Shekwana Paka Tichia Yakano, it's an Bama Ticket E aka Pushu Manako, That's over. Nata.
Another subtype of natural speech is what I call ritual text. These sort of recordings, the speaker or speakers are somewhat restrained, but not by the researcher, but by the fact that the text itself is largely set, something like a prayer or a song, for example. So here's a song in which Sokin Delema sings about the birds heralding the coming of the rains.
Chekemana kotela loko makai yako aya Pisho no na moseme Aya metongwa no koe No amo atusha Pisho wa moseme Aya te kongwa no koe No amo atusha Pisho wa moseme.
Other types of materials include images, such as this one taken of my temporary setup at Hukumako camp in August of 2021. When we return to the monthly totals, we can use this to read a sort of narrative of the larger documentation of Hadza over time. For example, if we isolate the first data collection point, we can see that it goes way back to August of 1990. This is because the deposit also contains legacy recording materials which were kindly contributed by other Hadza language researchers. The first recordings were made by Alex de Vogt and consist of 2 word lists as well as a half-hour recording of stories. The second chunk of materials represent 6 months, with one portion in 1992 and a second portion in 1997. This is the work done during Bonnie Sands's Hadza language research, specifically in the Mangola area. This is a photo of her with 2 Hadza men, Gudo Mahia and Sabina, during an elicitation session. The next chunk of materials corresponds to the ELDP-funded project mentioned above, which, again, ran from late 2019 until late 2021. These materials are primarily the ones collected by the Hadza local researchers. So here's an image of Hadza local researcher Nage Chaka, here on the left, conducting one such recording. It should be said that I omitted a bit of data here in the chart. This is primarily because when I display it, it skews the view of the rest of the data, makes the other bars rather small. This is data recorded during a series of forest walks by small groups of men or women using chest-mounted cameras and microphones. This is an image of the young men from left to right, Shalia Hassani, Mgana Lucas, and Ntume Juma, taken shortly before their forest walk on August 8th of 2021. The fourth chunk of data, corresponding to an 8-month period, represents the work primarily phonological elicitation carried out by Jeremy Coburn during his doctoral research. The chunk highlighted here corresponds to the data collected during the Firebird-funded project. Again, this collection of natural speech occurred primarily in the Hadza communities to the northwest of Lake Eyasi, representing a community who has traditionally not had a chance to be present in the research. And finally, despite the large funded portions of the project being primarily completed at this point, Hadza language research continues and data collection also continues, and it will be continually added to the archive. As such, materials like these, which correspond primarily to me investigating specific research questions, will continue to be archived with the Endangered Languages Archive. Of the 384 speakers represented in the archive collection, 193 are male and 191 are female, quite an impressive balance between genders across the data collection. The oldest speaker represented in the collection was born in 1918 and the youngest in 2009. Of the 384 participants, 127 were listed as monolingual. So in my observations, I find this quite hard to believe, as virtually all Hadza people which I have met are at least bilingual. What has happened here seems to be Hadza people perhaps being reticent to divulge their full linguistic biographies in fear that bilingualism might count them out of being included in the research. This would reflect a history of previous Hadza research conducted by anthropologists which heavily favored Hadza people thought to be quote-unquote isolated or unaffected by outside groups. I've said elsewhere that I believe this kind of characterization of almost every Hadza person to be a fiction, but here we can see echoes of it in how Hadza people in this sample have chosen to present themselves. 184 Hadza people in this sample said that they were bilingual in both Hadza and Swahili, with a rather small set of bilingual people, just 8 here, bilingual in Hadza and Sukuma. These 8 people would have been living in the communities to the northwest of Lake Eyasi. In addition to bilingual speakers, at least 79 participants could also speak a third language. In many cases, this was a nearby Bantu language, such as Sukuma or Ihanzu, but in several cases, this was Iraq or Datogo, or even English, the language of higher education. Now, I'd like to provide a bit of information on the level of data processing in the collection. Note first that I have been calling it the Hadza collection and not the Hadza corpus. This is mainly because what we have created thus far is not solely a collection of transcribed and translated texts that are ready to search by linguists. Indeed, there are elements in the collection which resemble corpora, and which could probably be used as such, but in the end, what is represented in this work is rather broader than that. For this project, I've distinguished 3 basic levels, which here I'll simply call Step 1, Step 2, and Step 3. Basically, any recording must pass through each of these steps in sequence. Materials in Step 1 have been assigned a unique file name and have been given the proper metadata. That is, a file now has a name which cannot be mixed up with other files, as well as a rough description of what the recording contains. All of the materials in the Hadza collection have reached this level of processing at least. So, for example, the files associated with the recording in the image above not only have a unique identifier, but the recording session is also described in terms of what the topic of conversation was, where it took place, and who it involved, etc. So here we can see that the file name 2021-0819_NCD was recorded in Domanga and is a natural speech recording centered on a story about the monitor lizard and the hyrax and how they quarreled over women. Recordings which have entered Step 2 have been listened to, segmented in Elan, transcribed into Hadza, and given a Swahili translation. Because this step is carried out by the Hadza local researchers, the Hadza transcriptions are not standardized. That is, the way a word is written may not be consistent, or it may not correspond to how I would write it in a more standardized working orthography. With that said, recordings which have reached Step 2 can be read for their content by anyone literate in Swahili and would therefore be useful for people interested in their narrative content. So here in this recording, we see time-aligned transcriptions of the Hadza and its Swahili translation. Step 3 represents what I see as basically a kind of final step in the basic processing of the data and involves looking through the rough Hadza transcriptions and adjusting them to the working orthography, providing an English translation, as well as parsing and glossing each utterance into constituent morphemes. Within the workflow I use, the representation of this in Elan looks something like what is highlighted on screen. Perhaps what is the most important part of the data here is that it can be more or less easily rendered into a traditional interlinear text, the kind of material that many of us are familiar with. I'd like now to provide a breakdown of what kinds of materials have reached what levels of processing in the collection. We'll start with elicitation. As we can see, a bit less than 10% has reached Step 3 thus far, and as such, there's a lot of space for further processing here. The same can be said for prompted speech, though the small amount of fully processed data here has more to do with the fact that most of the prompted speech was collected less than 6 months ago. Moving to natural speech now, these are perhaps the recordings whose processing is of the highest priority, in that this material will often be the most dense in both linguistic and cultural insight. Currently, of the 215 hours of natural speech recordings, around 16 hours have reached Steps 2, so being transcribed and translated into Swahili. A small number of recordings, totaling around 1 hour, has been given a standardized Hadza transcription and an English translation, as well as parsing and glossing. As such, if we take a global look at the entire collection, we can see that only a very small fraction has been processed to a level where the average linguist would find it useful. This is due to a phenomenon known in the language documentation literature as the transcription bottleneck. This refers to the reality that while it is now technically possible to record and archive a large volume of language material, the rendering of these materials into transcripts in this case with a standardized orthography and English translation, as well as time-aligned parsing and glossing, is the most time-consuming task, and in practice will take exponentially more time than it took to collect the materials. This is, I would say, the profile of a relatively new archive collection, and I expect the processing to proceed steadily in the coming years. To conclude then, what we've seen in today's lecture was a rather technical presentation of Hadza language documentation over the past several years. We started with a chronological narrative and then examined the contents of the archival collection, as well as its processing status up to this point. What hasn't been mentioned at all is really how this interfaces, or how it could interface, with the community from which the data came, that is, the Hadza people themselves. I hope that we'll have some time to discuss this, as well as address this in a bit more detail in next week's lecture. Once again, I'll end with acknowledgements. Alex DeVoe, Bonnie Sands, Richard Griscom, and Jeremy Coburn were all active contributors to the existing Hadza language documentation, and I would like to thank them for their effort and their commitment to the preservation of this important language and cultural materials. I would also like to thank everybody who appeared in the photos I used throughout this presentation. I would like to specifically thank the Hadza local researchers, Mariamu Anyawire, Bunga Paulo, Ndeko Simon, Nange Chaka, Angela Sampson, Jacobo Lubumba Mayunga, Muguli, Elizabeth Minja, and Paulina Nyerere for their crucial work in the collection and in the creation of the archival material. Once again, I would like to acknowledge the funders here in this presentation, especially the Firebird Foundation for Anthropological Research, as well as the Endangered Languages Documentation Program. And I would also like to thank my host here, Mauro Tosco, and the University of Turin for hosting me during this series of lectures. So thank you, and here are my references.